Hello, everyone. This is a new system that we're using today called Zoom. So I'm going to just right now ask you to pardon any technical issues. I'm just going to do a sound check to make sure people can hear me. So if you can hear me, in the lower right corner of your screen, you should see some options there, and you should have an option to raise your hand. So if you could raise your hand if you could hear me. Oh, it's in the center. I apologize. Oh, good. I have lots of hands raised. That's awesome. Okay, great. Okay, then we're going to go ahead and get started. I've muted everybody's microphone. And then at the end, we do have a section for questions, and you could chat the questions that you have. I'll go ahead and ask at the end if anybody has any questions. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm just going to start my slideshow here. Okay, so today we're talking about, this is the first part of a two-part series on ADA issues. So today the first thing we're talking about are service dogs, horses, and therapy emotional support animals. And yes, there are such a thing as therapy chickens. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the law is in Michigan on these types of animals, and then also some tips on some policies. And there's also some new legislation working its way through the lame duck session that could affect this. So we're going to talk about that as well. So as usual, I have to give you a disclaimer that says that this information is meant as general information. It is not meant as legal advice. Although I have a law degree, I cannot act as your attorney. So if you have any questions about this, or you have maybe you suspect that something I'm saying is incorrect, you always want to make sure you double check with your actual attorney. I am Clare Membiela. I'm the library law consultant for the Library of Michigan. Here's my contact information. Please, I welcome all questions, and if there's anything I can do to help you, please don't hesitate to contact me. I get a lot of questions, so sometimes my return time, I try to do it at least within the week. Sometimes it goes a little bit beyond that, but I try to get to them as soon as I can. So just give me a call if you have something that is urgent. Make sure you let me know that, and I'll take care of it first. Okay, so service animals. So Michigan follows the federal definitions for service animals under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And under the Americans with Disabilities Act, there are two animals recognized as legitimate service animals. Right now, the federal law actually only recognizes dogs. So any breed of dog, but it can only be a dog that is recognized under the ADA as a service animal. Different states can add to that definition. Michigan has chosen to recognize dogs and miniature horses. And that's miniature horses is only within the last couple years. So dogs and miniature horses are recognized as service animals in the state of Michigan. Now, let's talk a little bit about service animals versus therapy animals. So service animals under the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as under the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act in Michigan, are animals, specifically dogs, and again in Michigan, dogs or miniature horses that are trained to perform specific tasks that assist people with managing disabilities in their daily life. Service animals are covered by the ADA, as I said, and the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act. So this is kind of a really specific definition. So assist people with managing disabilities in their daily life. There are cases that show that, you know, if an animal, say for example, a dog has been trained to retrieve a TV remote, that is not necessarily a specific task that assists people with managing disabilities in their daily life. So the courts in these cases actually look at what the tasks are that the animal is trained to perform. But most of all, the first thing that is looked at is the animal actually trained? And so, you know, we've all seen service animals that, you know, everything from leader dogs to animals that, will bark if a certain thing occurs. My son had a friend who had epilepsy, and the dog was trained to bark whenever a seizure was coming on. Um, he had another friend that had a dog that she had a neurological disorder that would cause her to faint a lot, and she had a dog that could find out, I guess, through a smell when she was going to pass out, and he would bark and lay down. So, there are very specific tasks. Now, that doesn't mean that if a dog retrieves a remote, it automatically isn't a service dog, but generally, if you have a service dog, it's trained to do many things, and one of those may also be to get the remote. But there is a case where a animal was declared not a service animal because its primary trained function was that it retrieved the remote for its owner. Now we have therapy and emotional support animals. Now, therapy and emotional support animals are meant to provide comfort, security, and emotional support. Typically, these animals are not trained in specific tasks related to a disability. Currently, these animals do not fall under the protection of the ADA or the Michigan Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act. So the main difference between service animals and therapy emotional support animals is that a service animal, again, is specifically trained to do tasks. Therapy and emotional support animals are typically not. They're typically, owners receive emotional support and comfort, usually just from the animal's existence and the animal's being close by and their nurturing nature, which is another reason why many different kinds of animals can be therapy and emotional support animals. Now, emotional support and therapy animals are recognized under some laws. Specifically, the federal government recognizes therapy and emotional support animals, specifically emotional support animals. They recognize them within the Air Transport Act and within the Fair Housing Act. So if you have, or if a person has an emotional support animal, which is usually an animal that essentially they'd have a prescription for from their, it could be their psychologist or their psychiatrist, could be their regular doctor, but usually it would be a mental health professional that has diagnosed an illness where an emotional support animal would be helpful. And then that usually there's a letter. So it's kind of like a prescription. It's usually a letter written on the doctor's stationery, signed by the doctor. Some instances they're required to be notarized. And that document is carried by the person who has the animal, and then it is presented to a landlord or someone who is going to be, I guess usually it would be a landlord if you're renting, and it, very often, or could be a hotel. Very often you might have buildings that don't take pets. And that way the person would still be able to rent in a building that prohibits pets upon exhibition of that particular documentation, and the landlord has to permit it. So that's one of the very, very few circumstances under which an emotional support animal is actually required to be accommodated. The other one is in the Air Transport Act, where, and this is where you hear about it in the news, like the therapy peacock and hamsters, and is again for air travel purposes. A person purchasing an air ticket or attempting to board an aircraft also can provide documentation, and airlines very often require that, can provide that letter from their doctor, the certified letter that shows that they need to have this animal near them. But as far as daily things like accommodation in businesses and schools and things like that, therapy and emotional support animals are not covered. So back to service animals. So service animals have to be trained. Now, there are not any kind of requirements that training has to be by a certified trainer. Different states may have rules on things like vests and things like that, but under the federal government, there is not a requirement for that. Many dogs do wear identification. And a lot of times that's actually for the protection of the dog as well as the protection of people around them, because a lot of you may know that when dogs are working, you're not supposed to interfere with them. Here in Library of Michigan, we have the Braille and Talking Book Library in our building, and we have lots of employees that do have service dogs. And you know that when you see the service dog on leash, on harness, you know not to interact with it. There's a couple that we actually have become friendly with, and you can see when we go down and we see the friend who has the dog, will talk to the friend, and you can see the dog in the dog's eyes that they're desperate to interact with you, but they're on duty and they're typically extremely well trained, so they do not break their training. But after work, sometimes coming out, we'll see the dog off harness. His name is Al, and Al gets very excited, and it's very fun to interact with him. He's a very sweet dog, but it really is interesting to see how well behaved they are on harness versus off harness. So a lot of times the vest helps the public not to interfere with a dog who may need to concentrate in order to keep its owner safe. Michigan does have a voluntary program. They are encouraged people with service dogs to register, and then they get a vest and a patch that recognizes the dog as a certified service animal. But there, again, is no requirement. For service animals must be housebroken. I guess that's the least amount of training other than a specific task that they have to have. And the owner must have control of the animal at all times. So even though a service dog is guaranteed entry pretty much into any place, that doesn't give it carte blanche. So if an animal cannot behave, so for example, if it barks or if it jumps on people, or it kind of behaves as a lot of like pets do, the owner of a building you can remove the animal. So just because it is a service animal means that regardless of behavior, that an owner or a library has no recourse. There are standards of behavior that must be held to, and if a service animal has an accident within a building, it can be asked to leave right away. So if you're confronted, and this is a problem that a lot of libraries have, and a question that I get asked a lot, that someone walks in your library and they have a dog with them, maybe a purse dog, maybe they have some other animal. Maybe it's a bird, or maybe it's a ferret, or maybe it's a chinchilla or a hedgehog. How do you determine whether or not it's a service animal versus a therapy animal? Well, number one, if it's not a dog or a miniature horse, right away, it's not a service animal, regardless of what that person says. Two, you can obviously tell if the person has an obvious disability. So for example, you have someone in a wheelchair, or someone who is blind and has a cane, or the dog is on a harness and the person appears blind, or there's some other indication of obvious disability. The second question is, and even if the person has an obvious disability, these other questions may still be asked. The proprietor of a business or a library, staff may ask two specific questions under the law in order to determine whether or not the animal is a service animal, the dog or the miniature horse is a service animal. The two questions are, is the animal a service animal required because of a disability? And you can't ask what the disability is, but you can just say, is this an animal required because of a disability? And the second question is, what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? So if the person says, well, nothing, no specific tasks, then it is not a service animal. If the person says, yes, it's been trained to perform X, Y, Z, I encourage people that I would not I would encourage staff not to make judgments on the task. Courts have made judgments, but the law on disabilities, the general rule of thumb in most instances is because we're talking in a lot of instances about civil rights, that the law looks at this very broadly. And so you're better off erring on the side of a disability. So if you're not sure, if someone says, well, this dog was trained to, follow me in case I trip, or the dog has been trained to, sniff perfumes because I have a severe allergy to peanuts or perfume, then you're probably better erring on the side of saying okay and letting the dog in. Because if the dog misbehaves, if you are thinking, oh, this dog does not look like a service animal, it's not really behaving, it does not seem very well trained, if you let the dog in, you can always ask it to leave if it exhibits inappropriate behavior. And the bar to inappropriate behavior is not really high. Because again, as I said, service animals tend to be extremely well trained and unobtrusive and quiet. So, unless, the dog's noise is related to the disability, if it barks, if it jumps up on people, if it, in any way behaves more like a normal pet as opposed to a service animal, the animal can be asked to leave. Now, there's also another kind of twist to this, and that is the difference between a therapy animal and an emotional support animal. And people tend to use these even in official documents, even like State of Michigan documents, and even sometimes in guidances. The term therapy animal and emotional support animal tend to be used interchangeably, but officially they're actually two different things. A therapy animal, like, you can kind of look at it from the perspective of individual and group. So a therapy animal is generally regarded as an animal that has been trained to work with one or groups of people to provide therapy at kind of like specific sessions. So you may have heard on college campuses, like I know MSU does this, I know that UDM does this, that they have dogs that are there to provide stress relief and comfort to students. So it's one dog, but it's used for many, many students. So the library or the campus might have a dog or two that at appointed times is available in specific places for any student or employee to come and interact with and to gain comfort or stress relief from that animal. So a lot of times therapy animals are animals where the owners have had them trained specifically to interact with many different types of people and act as that kind of comfort providing animal. So they tend to be trained, but they tend to be used with groups of people and not necessarily with just their owners. And it might be something that businesses have brought in. So you might be a library that has a program where you bring in a therapy animal as a special program, but that's not necessarily the same as being open to permitting emotional support animals in. Now, emotional support animals or comfort animals has been defined as an animal. This would be the animal that has been specifically, say, prescribed by a physician or a mental health professional, that is used in order to address a specific psychological or physical need. So PTSD. Or I know there are many other victims of other kinds of trauma, like sexual assault trauma, or autism, or other issues where depression, where having an animal nearby, having a warm animal that's very affectionate, that is bonded to you, can be extremely comforting and can be the difference between being able to go out of your house during the day and function and not. So an emotional support animal is one of these animals, the animals that are prescribed specifically for people who are suffering from certain emotional and perhaps physical disabilities that are not service animal related. So they might not be physical disabilities that require assistance from an animal, but a lot of times they're more emotional disabilities, emotional illnesses where they require a comfort animal. And again, these are recognized under the Fair Housing Act and the Air Carrier Access Act. Now, there are, as I said, there are limitations to even with a service animal. So if all libraries have to permit service animals to come into the library, but you can ask the 2 questions, and once the animal's in the building, the library is not responsible for providing food or water or a special place for the service animal to be. So you don't have to make great strides to reconfigure your space to permit a service animal. Not any more than some kind of obvious accommodation where if someone is attending a performance or a program and chairs are very close together and the dog needs to lie down, maybe you make sure they're on the end of the row, or you remove a chair so that the dog can lie down. But other than obvious things, there's no large accommodation that a library needs to do. Essentially, you would treat the animal just like you would another person, like a child or any other person that's accompanying that person. Now, as far as miniature horses go, because miniature horses can vary a little bit in size, and because miniature horses can be large, heavy animals, there are some specific exceptions for miniature horses. So if you have a facility, you're a very, very small place of business or a very tiny, tiny library, if your facility cannot accommodate the miniature horse's size and weight, for example, having the horse come in would block egress in an emergency. So no matter how the person has the horse, it significantly blocks access for people to be able to easily come in and out of the building, and would certainly block in cases of an emergency. If the horse is so heavy that the building, maybe a second floor, maybe if you have an older building and you have a second floor that is not supported in a way that can handle something that weighs like a miniature horse, it's possible that you would not have to accommodate so that the horse can go up on the second floor. Now, if you do have a situation where the miniature horse, for whatever legitimate reason, can't be accommodated, you would still have to accommodate the person. So, for example, you had someone who came in the library and the miniature horse could not make it up the stairs or would block egress, then the miniature horse could be, tethered outside, and the person would have to be accommodated in the library in order to obtain whatever information they would like to obtain. So, with a reasonable accommodation, it could be bringing the books outside. It could be, had someone, being with the person to help them get what they need, but, those kind of accommodations. Just like we discussed, the service animal, whether it's a dog or a miniature horse, can be asked to leave if the animal's out of control and the handler does not take effective action to control it. Now, animals are animals, so you may have a service animal that, for whatever reason, barks once, or knocks over something because it turns around. The key thing is that if something happens, the handler is able to immediately bring the dog under control. So if a dog barks, the handler issues a command and the dog stops. Not, constant yapping, not continued barking at people who walk by, that kind of thing. If the animal is not housebroken, so if the animal has an accident on the floor, the library is not responsible for cleaning it up, and the animal may be asked to leave. That's under the discretion of the library. Doesn't mean you can't help clean it up, which I'm thinking, depending on the circumstances, would be certainly a humane or nice thing to do, but it's not a requirement. Now, can you have a policy that includes both? Yes. There is nothing in Michigan or federal law that requires you to admit therapy animals, but there is nothing that says you may not. If you were running a restaurant, there may be some considerations, but in a library, there is not anything preventing you from permitting therapy animals in. So your board and you may decide if you want to permit therapy animals. But if you do, there are some things you need to consider. You want to make sure that you hold them to the same standard as service animals. And that just makes things easier for everybody. You can include more animals than dogs and horses. Since there is no standard right now, there's no legal standard for what animals count as therapy animals, and there are therapy tarantulas and all kinds of therapy lizards. And if the library wants to restrict it, so if for whatever reason you determine, okay, we're fine with chickens and spiders and lizards and birds, but we're not cool with cats, or the library can determine what types of animals in terms of service animals or therapy animals it permits. I would recommend, if you go that route though, that you talk to your attorney and you have very solid reasons as to why you do not permit certain animals. So that when that person who walks in with that animal, you can give them very good explanation, clear and reasonable explanation as to why you don't permit that particular type of animal. Make sure that any policy that you draft, you want to make sure it goes through your attorney. That's just good policy. The Michigan Civil Rights Department, and later on in this presentation I have some images of it, has an excellent frequently asked questions handout. It's like a 2-page handout that you could print back and front. And I heartily recommend that you make a few copies of this and you keep it at your CERC or reference desk, so that if you have a patron come in with an animal that you're not going to admit, perhaps it is definitely not a service animal and you do not admit therapy animals or emotional support animals, you hand them this FAQ, and it very specifically says that therapy and emotional support animals are not covered under the ADA or the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act, and that libraries or other public places may restrict them, and it is okay to not permit them to go in. It's very clear language, so there's really no argument that could be made. It also goes over specifically what a service animal is, so that because it's so clear and because it has the Michigan Commission of Civil Rights seal on it, and it has contact information for Michigan Commission on Civil Rights, it's an excellent handout, because you can just hand it to the person and say, here's the information, here's the reason why we're not letting your animal in, and if you have any questions or complaints, you can call the Michigan Commission on Civil Rights and they will reiterate everything that's on this sheet. So it really kind of can prevent some uncomfortable interactions at your service desk. Now, this brings us to this new law. And we're almost finished here. SB 66. So SB 66 is described as a prohibition on individuals misrepresenting a need for a service animal and to revise the code to include emotional support animals. So this new law, this is working its way through the lame duck legislature. It's already gone through the Senate. It is currently sent to a House committee. So the next step would be a hearing at the House committee. And then assuming it goes through, it went through, I was at the hearing for the Senate, and it breezed through the Senate. So assuming it goes through the House, the next step would be to go back to the floor and get voted on and then signed by the governor. So I'm keeping an eye on this bill. And what this bill does is, the implications of this bill is that it defines an emotional support animal. So it specifically says that an emotional support animal is an assistance animal that provides emotional support to a person with a disability who has a disability-related need for that support. It makes it a misdemeanor for a person to falsely represent that he or she is in possession of an emotional support animal, a service animal in training in any public place, or for purposes of obtaining housing. So if you go to an apartment that doesn't take animals and you say your animal is an emotional support animal, you can get in trouble. Or if for people who take their pets everywhere and then maintain that they're therapy animals when in fact they're not, this makes it a misdemeanor to do that. Interestingly, it also makes it illegal for a physician or a psychologist to give somebody a documentation for a therapy animal when in fact that person does not really merit a therapy animal. So, for example, you have a friend who is a physician and they just give you this because you asked for it. Or your regular family doctor. You say, oh, this animal means a lot to me. Can you just say, and they write a note for it. This prevents that. There's some fairly strict requirements for medical providers within this bill that would say that a medical provider has to have been seeing the patient for 6 months prior to the issuance of the letter or documentation authorizing an emotional support animal, and has to have been seeing the person for the reasons that they need an emotional support animal. And it provides some stiff penalties for medical professionals that are, not complying with this. So I thought that was kind of an interesting part of this bill. So the legislature is really trying to crack down on people who are maintaining have emotional support animals when in fact they really do not. It also, and this is something else that I find very interesting, permits the request of documentation certifying that the person is in possession of a legitimate emotional support or service animal. Now, this is kind of interesting because currently under federal law, you cannot ask someone with a service animal to provide proof. You can only ask those 2 questions. So personally, I think it would be interesting to see if that holds up or whether there will be some court cases that might strike that part down. Now, as far as an emotional support animal goes, the way the bill is written is this would permit a library to request documentation from somebody or from that person's doctor, or it would permit a landlord to request that information to prove that the person actually has a legitimate support animal and that it's a necessary animal. So this is actually this bill has some very interesting aspects to it. Of course, there is nothing yet that really explains how all this would work. Who could, for example, who can specifically request documentation, how you request documentation, what the timing is for documentation. It does describe the documentation, which would be a letter from the medical professional that would have to be notarized. So the question is whether the person could carry the document on them and you could ask for it, or whether the library would have to ask the doctor. It's a little unclear on that, and that's a very interesting part of it because right now, as I said, specifically for service animals, federal law doesn't permit you to request that documentation. So it would be very interesting to see how that moves forward. But this idea that the legislature is looking at this kind of widespread misuse of therapy animals is kind of interesting and could be helpful to public libraries down the road and could possibly make it a little easier to craft some policies. And so we're keeping an eye on this, and as the bill works through, you will hear from me. So I have some more information here. We have some information from the ADA network. The very first link, I had labeled it, but it looks like my label didn't come out, is the Michigan Department of Civil Rights documentation where you can get the FAQ. There's also some other good information on that site. There's a link here to the Department of Justice Civil Rights that talks about service animals. There is a very good document on the American Veterinary Medical Association site, and they have a really nice kind of chart of the definitions of these different animals and how they differ from each other. And so I found that very interesting. So for training and things, I think that perhaps that would be something that would be useful to look at. And then at the very bottom, there is the NOLO Press information on service dogs and emotional support animals and accessing public places. So that's not Michigan specific, but it is a really good guide and useful guide on how you can, in terms of drafting policies. Now, I have this screen here that shows the images from the civil rights document. So I just want to kind of give you the FAQ document an example of how helpful this can be. So one of them, it's set up in a question and answer format, and it says that a service animal is not a pet. The question is, I have a comfort animal, an emotional support animal, or a therapy dog. Isn't that a service animal? And it specifically says, no, it is not. And then at the very bottom, it says, while comfort animals are often used as part of a medical treatment plan, they are not considered service animals under the ADA. So this really pretty clearly tells anybody who is arguing with your staff that their animal is a service animal, that an emotional support animal is permitted under the ADA. This pretty much comes out and says, no, it is not, in very clear language. And then some of the other questions, for example, it says, can you be asked to leave? Yes, you can be asked to leave, even if it's a service animal. So if a service animal can be asked to leave, for sure, a therapy animal can be asked to leave. Now, policy tips. Training is very important in this circumstance. Anytime you're dealing with civil rights, especially ADA is very complicated. Answer and can I talk about this? And it's very it's very dicey because a lot of times in the law it's situational. The facts of a particular circumstance can matter in civil rights. And so it gets, from a legal perspective, it gets very complicated. So training is very important. So you want to make sure your staff knows the two questions they can ask if they're unsure if something is a therapy animal, if a dog is a therapy animal or a service animal. Now, of course, you know right away that if the animal is not a dog or a miniature horse, it is, in fact, if it is, if it's not a dog or a miniature horse, then it's obviously not a service animal. You would want to, I see someone's asking a question, so I will get to it in 1 second. You want to provide written documentation with all of your policies. It's always good to have it in writing. You can also have signing indicating that service animals are welcome. The Michigan Civil Rights Department has some really nice reproducible signage that you can post that says service animals are welcome. You can include on your policy or anything you might want to hand to somebody about this, contact information for the Michigan Commission on Civil Rights. If you are going to have emotional support animals, or actually if you're not going to allow emotional support animals, include that as a written policy. If you do permit them, make sure you have clear guidelines as to what behavior you will tolerate. So that if there's a problem and your staff needs to ask somebody to leave, then it's very clear. As I'm sure a lot of you know, with your policies, if they're written and they're clear, then it makes things a whole lot easier for your staff at the front desk. Train staff not to engage in a lot of judgment as far as like judging whether what a legitimate service animal, or more specifically what a legitimate task is with those questions. So is the dog as part, to help a disability, and is a dog trained, or is the animal trained to perform specific tasks relating to the disability? It's really not for the staff or for any of us to judge whether a task is part of a daily coping with a disability. I strongly would recommend that you train your staff not to make that judgment. And it's really more of a yes or no. They're not trained or they are trained. Because it's always better to err on the side of admitting the animal dog or miniature horse as a service animal. And then if the animal misbehaves, you can always ask it to leave, because even service animals can be asked to leave. So it's, you know, if you're not sure, it's better to err on the side of assuming there's a disability than getting in trouble with the Commission on Civil Rights. Okay, now I see there are a couple questions here. I know we aren't required to provide the animal with food or water, but are we required to allow someone to feed their animal while in the library? That's a judgment call. There is no law that says you have to. If it's a very, very hot day, then you may want to permit the people to give them water. You can certainly ask them to do it in a particular place. If you have the space, you can say, "Can you please do it in the lobby?" Or, can you do it in a corner where if the water spills, it's not going to be damaging? You can certainly do that. You could put a mat by the front door if you have a lot of service animals. Same thing with food. I would say, you can, if you have a lot of service animals, you can say, again, ask them to go to a particular place. You can say, here's the corner in the lobby on the tile floor that if your dog needs to eat something, they can. If it's a particularly hot day or it's really snowy or rainy out, if it's a nice day, you can ask them to do it outside. Again, as long as it's, you have it in your policy and it's clear and it's done with respect, there's probably not going to be an issue there. So it's, a lot of it's just a matter of common sense and a little bit of compassion. Oh, thank you. I have a typo in my fourth point on my bullet. I will fix that. Thank you very much for letting me know that. I apologize about that. Sometimes my fingers just go the wrong way. Does anybody have any other questions in the chat? No? Okay, we are recording this. Our new system actually provides us with a link to the recording almost right away. So I will be sending all of you the link to this recording as well as this PowerPoint. And I also have a couple sample policies that I will send out to all of you by the end of the day. Service animals in training. Service animals in training, again, this is kind of right on the line. There's no requirement that you have to let them in since they are not trained yet as service animals. That's kind of a judgment call for your library. The part of how are they going to learn to be good service animals if they don't learn to interact with people? And so it might be a service to permit them in the library. You may want to choose your time if you're not right in the middle of a big program and it's not super crowded. Again, it could be a judgment call. You are not required to let them in for training. Thank you very much for your kind words. And looks like that's it. It is, we're right at our time here. Thank you very much for your attendance, and we will be having another one next month. Our one next month will be part 2 of ADA, and we're going to deal with some other ADA issues like accommodations for programs and things like that. I will be sending out a notice on Mish Label, and you should see the registration on the form probably in the next couple weeks. I hope y'all have a great holiday and y'all are safe and you have a fun time. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye.